Good evening. Good evening, everyone. All our Book Passage community out there. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for our conversations with authors. We really appreciate your patronage. If this is the first time you're tuning in to Book Passage, well, a hearty welcome. If you've seen our events online before, welcome back. We are very grateful to all of our loyal patrons out there. Thank you again for joining us. For those of you who may not know, Book Passage has two locations. We have our beautiful store in Corte Madera, and we also have our store in San Francisco in the Ferry Building. And both stores are open for business 7 days a week. So come on in. You can call us on the phone. You can buy your books that way. You can come into the store and browse, or of course, you can order from our website. So my name is Cheryl Bronstein. I am one of the event coordinators at Book Passage. And again, very, very happy to be here with you this evening. We have a wonderful program teed up for you. And I'm just going to mention a few of the very great things we've got going on. If you're not familiar, please look at bookpassage.com, our calendar of events, because we have a very busy January, February, March schedule that's already up there. And we want you to take a look, put it on your calendars so you can save the dates for some of these great events that we have going on. We do have an event this Saturday at 1 p.m. In our Corte Madera store, and that will be hosting the amazing novelist Jane Smiley. And she will be there for an event and a signing for her new novel, A Dangerous Business. This is a free event. Again, it's this Saturday at 1 p.m. in Corte Madera, so just come on down. You can get your picture taken with her. You can get some signed books for the holidays. On January 21st, we have an in-person event with Deb Perlman of Smitten Kitchen. And Deb will be discussing her newest cookbook, Smitten Kitchen Keepers. And this event will take place again at 1 p.m. in our Corte Madera store. Tickets to this event are still available. So please, again, look at our website, bookpassage.com. We have all of our events. We've got classes. And of course, we have in-person events. We have virtual events. We have hybrid events. We are just very busy bringing you amazing authors, either coming into the store or into your living room. So check out our calendar. We don't want you to miss any of the great and exciting things we have going on at our Book Passage to community. And here at Book Passage, our mission is to enrich, engage, and inspire. And Book Passage has been a Bay Area institution and a family-owned business for over 40 years. We are so grateful to all of our loyal customers. Thank you for making that happen. We look forward to serving you for another 40 years. Well, it has been 10 years since the attack on the U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi, which killed Ambassador Christopher Stevens and 3 other Americans. This horror is very personal for me. I did know Chris Stevens, and the loss of this heroic man and his colleagues was just horrific and a huge blow to America. In his new book, Benghazi, Ethan Chorin makes it clear why Benghazi still matters today and why we cannot afford to continue overlooking and misunderstanding the events that ensued. Ethan Chorin is a former diplomat, senior political analyst, author, and environmental entrepreneur. From 2004 to 2006, he was posted in Libya to help set up the U.S. mission. 6 years later, as co-director of NGO, he became a witness to the Benghazi attack and its aftermath. He was nominated to succeed Stevens as the ambassador. A widely respected expert on Libya, Chorin is the author of Exit the Colonel, The Hidden History of Libyan Revolution and Translating Libya, in search of the Libyan short story. His work has appeared in numerous publications that we are all very familiar with: the New York Times, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, Forbes, Newsweek. I could go on and on. The list is very long. He has been a regular commentator on Libya on BBC, and of course, you've probably seen him on CNBC, CNN, CBS, and C-SPAN. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Fulbright Hays Fellow, and he has held fellow and senior fellow positions at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Yale School of Management, and the Dubai School of Government. He lives in the New York area. He has the cutest little Habanese named Rami, who is with him tonight. And we are very honored that he is joining us here at our Book Passage virtual event. Tonight, Ethan is going to be joined by Whitney Hischier. Whitney is a lecturer at the Haas School of Business and the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, where she teaches strategy, global leadership, and innovation. She works with organizations around the world on strategic planning issues, as well as the application of red teaming stress testing tools for improved decision-making. Now, Whitney holds a BA from Stanford in International Relations and an MBA from the Haas School. It is a great honor to welcome these two to our Book Passage virtual stage, two incredible writers, two heavyweights in the world of diplomacy, Ethan Chorin and Whitney Hischier. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
Thank you also.
Great. So, Ethan, I think we'll start from the beginning here tonight and would love to just understand a little bit more. You've been connected to Libya for over 17 years. How did that happen? How did a guy growing up in Berkeley end up working in the Middle East and specifically becoming a Libya expert?
Well, that's a good question. Probably Berkeley had something to do with it. I had an interest in languages and other cultures, and had the great opportunity to travel a little bit in the Middle East when I was much younger. And much like my background was very similar to that of Ambassador Stevens, who followed a similar route to basically falling in love with the Middle East and ultimately Libya also. So I was a Middle East Studies major as an undergrad, and had a chance to travel to North Africa and experience life there as an undergrad, and then one thing led to the other. Started studying Arabic seriously, and then other regional languages, and at some point just counted up my credits and said, "Well, this is the career that I've chosen for myself so far," and haven't really looked back since.
Well, it's a fascinating path and has led you to this recent book. And I'm curious about kind of the timing, right? As you know, most Americans have seen the name Benghazi in the news, on and off for years, parts of scandals tied to our own elections, definitely a divisive issue. Why now? Why did the book kind of call you to talk about it 10 years later?
Well, I guess I should have included some of this background in my previous question, but I was a diplomat, as from the introduction, in Libya when the relations with the U.S. and Libya were reopened following the Iraq War and 9/11, and had a really spectacular experience as one of a few diplomats posted to Tripoli, and sort of looking under the hood of Colonel Gaddafi's Libya. If there are a couple of several figures that Americans are of certainly a certain age are familiar with, Colonel Gaddafi was certainly one of them, and the opportunity to look under the hood of his waning dictatorship was quite striking in many ways. And in that context, I grew to really love Libya, and I left for other posts and didn't think I'd be back anytime soon. But and ultimately I left the Foreign Service several years later. And at the time, the Arab Spring was starting, the revolutions that swept the Middle East in late 2010 to on. And I was in Dubai and watching this underway, and felt myself just completely compelled to go back to Libya and try to and appreciate the fact that Libyans who I'd gotten to know very well and had kept in touch with were finally sort of seemed to be breaking on the threshold of a new life. And I wanted to be back, particularly in Benghazi. So if a Libyan American colleague of mine and I set up this seems sort of like an unlikely thing to do at the time, but we decided to set up a nonprofit that was going to try to bring American medical technology and teaching institutions, including some of the UC system, back into Benghazi and try to sort of start rebuilding and addressing some of the gaps in medical coverage, particularly emergency medicine in Benghazi. And in that context, Christopher Stevens was a colleague and a friend. We had essentially, I became suddenly a witness to the start of the attack itself, and the immediate aftermath. And I had this feeling at the time that as this all was unfolding, that I was being witness to something that was going to have a much greater impact than it seemed on the face of it at the time. Not just the loss of U.S. ambassador and 3 other Americans, but something that might, in fact, shift American appetite away from the Middle East and towards other things. I spent much of the time during the attack holed up on the phone with the mission at first, and then holed up in a hotel room, looking at a scene of sort of some partial chaos beneath me. It was really quite a traumatic experience. So the 10 years after that, I was struck also. It took me 8 days to come back to the U.S. I had to wait for one of my colleagues to get out of Libya, and by the time we both made it back to the United States, the scandal. We basically I was surprised by the intensity of the attacks and the recriminations on both sides regarding to what had actually happened, and the confusion, because to us and several of the people that I knew quite well who were in somewhat prominent positions as diplomats and corporate people, they had a line of sight on together we all had little pieces of the view of what happened at the compound. Obviously, I wasn't an eyewitness, I was an oral witness, but I had been a witness to what was going up to it and what was after. And it just, the stories that were emerging on both sides, on the left and the right, were just simply did not ring true to me. The Wall Street Journal called me up as I was landing in Oakland, and asked me what I thought of this video controversy, and I had no idea what they were talking about, because we'd never heard of any video on the ground, and I was preoccupied with other things afterward. And that video, maybe it would be useful to go back and sort of talk a little bit about the circumstances of the attack itself, maybe after this, but. What I was going to say to your question, basically, why now? One, it's been a long 10-year journey of trying to tell my own story of what happened, and not only around the attack but to provide context, which was sorely missing for the American public. I mean, I think most people, if they think of Benghazi these days and they remember it, are if you have left-leaning tendencies, you associate this with a smattering of fake news and attempts to discredit then Secretary Hillary Clinton from during her presidential campaign. And if you're right, it's on the right, it's usually a sign of a democratic cover-up of some kind. And in this course, over the last 10 years, basically those two competing narratives took on a life of their own and mushroomed into this sort of what I call sort of a political exercise in American self-harm. Essentially, everyone was talking at each other and blaming each other for this or that, and basically there were elements of truth and falsehood on both sides. But nobody could really penetrate this because the political narratives became so deeply rooted that they were sort of, at a certain point, they became impossible to uproot or correct. So I think it's been a long time in coming, but my attempt in this book is to take a as balanced as possible an approach to the attack, where it came from, the scandal, and the really important effects of the Benghazi attack. I think still, because of this uncertainty over what happened and who was right, etc., all of this stuff, and the very sort of big claims of the committees that had investigated it. People, generally Americans, have this feeling like, well, that was sort of a past occurrence and it had no bearing on the present. But I argue in the book very sort of as well as and precisely as I can that Benghazi actually had a major impact on the tenor of U.S. political dialogue, that it rapidly increased the polarization of left and right. It certainly had a major influence on the election of 2016, President Trump's win and Hillary Clinton's loss. And it threw American diplomacy and foreign affairs into something of a scramble of where risk aversion was the buzzword. You basically, nobody wanted to take certain risks lest it suck us back into another Benghazi-like scenario, and people got yanked in front of committees, et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of consequences that are sort of visible in what we're experiencing today.
Yeah, and no, that's fantastic. And I think, you refer to this as sort of a rationality devouring creature. I thought that was a really interesting way to think about the event in terms of like kind of forcing Americans into these very biased viewpoints and very polarized, kind of reflective of some of the sort of more deeply seated challenges nationally. What I love the way that you framed the story in the book too, and I want to get more to the attack, but also kind of leading up to it. I think for many that don't understand a lot about what happened, it seemed like a one-off terrorist event. And you frame this as there were multiple factors that led to this event happening. And they were a long time in coming, as you mentioned previously. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, like just what were some of the confluence of trends, events, attitudes of the U.S. and the U.S. like kind of foreign service that in some ways allowed this to happen?
Well, as you say, the Benghazi attack was a long time in coming, and it was I think the biggest sort of antecedent, the most immediate antecedent, although there were several others before it, was 9/11 and the American response to it. And the fact that certainly that Libya became a major exhibit in the U.S. sort of policy towards the Middle East in a kind of a covert, overt and covert way. We had a rapprochement, a mending of terms with Muammar Gaddafi, in part because the Bush administration wanted to saw Libya as a kind of a redeeming opportunity in the face of an Iraq war that was going off the rails. Gaddafi could provide a nice sort of reform story that he was turning away from his terrorist actions and was embracing some form of reform and possible democratization. The U.S. was looking for a weapons of mass destruction win, which obviously didn't happen in Iraq. And Gaddafi could say, well, I was trying to build a nuclear weapon and now I'm giving all that material back to you. Also, Gaddafi could offer what wasn't happening in Iraq at the time, lots of contracts, or at least the promise of deals. So all of these things made, and I think there was also behind that, there was the question of how to deal with Gaddafi's enemies, whom we had supported in various ways in the past. There were the secular sort of military adversaries, people who had been close to Gaddafi and then defected and then came under the CIA's influence, et cetera. And then you had the Islamists, the sort of more radical groups that were using Islam as a sort of a cloak for political activity and a means of increasing Islam's overt influence on social issues. And after 9/11, the U.S. decided that it was going to go and essentially capture and return to Gaddafi a series of radicals who had become associated with and in some ways very close to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And these individuals were basically, illegally kidnapped and rendered back to Gaddafi for torture and interrogation. It turned out later that, in fact, many of the those who were doing the interrogation and torture were the Americans, not at this point the Libyans, although it was probably some of that too. And along with this rapprochement with Gaddafi came this question of what to do with these radicals who had been cut their teeth in Afghanistan in the late 70s, early 80s, fighting as mujahideen, fighting the Soviet Union. What to do with them within the context of a reforming Libya in which Gaddafi was their enemy. So the United States, at least implicitly, was looking at this, and other European powers were looking at this as an opportunity potentially to discredit al-Qaeda by flipping these radicals, basically trying to convince them to give up their radical ways and radical beliefs and become an accommodation with and make friendly with the regime. So there was a long sort of process where, in fact, so we went from torturing and rendering and torturing to trying to assist in some ways the conversion of these groups into a more friendly force that would be integrated into the Gaddafi regime that itself was reforming. So this sounds like a bit of a crazy story, but and these kinds of flips between one policy and the next, particularly with Gurugard's Islamist organizations in the Middle East, has happened repeatedly. It's not just Islamists; it's the Soviet. There are lots of parallels in the Soviet Union and in Vietnam, etc. But we basically got ourselves into a situation in which no one predicted the Arab Spring would come along and that there'd be this revolution. And then all of a sudden, these groups and everyone else was mixed together, and everyone basically used that chaos to try to gain political advantage. And that is the origins. I mean, you want to look for an immediate antecedent to the Benghazi attack. That's it. These groups basically became part of the vanguard of an Islamist attempt to reverse and insert themselves higher punch higher than their numbers within Libya and try to create a new Libya. And Benghazi was a weak point. And after the United States intervened in Libya, the Benghazi became a sort of a vulnerable spot from which they could understood that they could hit the United States and that we would withdraw. So that's a long explanation, but it's quite complicated. And
it is. No, absolutely. And I think what is so fascinating about it is it's this very complicated situation where internally there's a lot of chaos. It sounds like U.S. foreign policy was sort of questionable in terms of strategic direction. That was flip-flopping too. And you mentioned in the book, and I want to talk a little bit about Ambassador Stevens, that we lacked the intelligence on the ground. I mean, he was probably one of the very few people who you mentioned he knew a lot. Maybe he didn't know enough on one hand, he knew too much on the other. And he was taking this heroic effort to try to hold down the fort. Can you talk a little bit about that and then kind of what happened in relation to the attack, since you did know Chris personally and had actually spoken to him, hours before this happened, and we're supposed to be there, right? I mean, it was just by chance that you weren't actually in the same place when all of this happened.
Yeah, he invited myself and a couple of my colleagues for a dinner that night at the mission, and it's something that I certainly don't cease thinking about. And I think one of when you're talking about like reasons that I wanted to write this book, one of them certainly was that a number of visible personalities I felt had been done an injustice by the sort of the media and suffered some unreasonable and untrue attacks. And I think Chris Stevens, even though both sides had hailed him as a hero, at the same time during the committee hearings and things, he took a lot of sort of backhanded or backdoor blame that it was he was reckless and had simply failed to appreciate how dangerous the situation was. And my experience of Chris Stevens and why he was in Benghazi at that point in time was very different. We had spoken at length a few months before, just after while he was being confirmed as ambassador, and he had sort of confided or related to me that he felt that the United States was missing an opportunity quickly to try to shore up the city of Benghazi and prevent Libya from essentially collapsing upon itself. And there were a number of indications that he felt somewhat responsible for both helping get the Obama administration to a yes on the intervention that ultimately overthrew Gaddafi, and then at the same time was faced with sort of a lack of the tools with which to try to fix the situation. And I think he felt, just as I felt at the time, that there was this window quickly closing, and if we could do what we each in very different ways could help bring American attention back to Benghazi. And in Chris Stevens's case, he was very passionate about trying to get the mission, as it was, upgraded to the status of a consulate, so that it would get the kind of resources and attention and money that with which to do the job that he couldn't do. So if you're looking for, again, he was blamed for being overly incautious, but I think he felt, actually Secretary Clinton, whom I interviewed for the book as well, had some interesting things to say about that, essentially one of her points was that Chris Stevens had been exposed to extreme danger from the moment he arrived in Libya on a cargo ship in early April of 2011 to just incredible amounts of danger. It was inevitable. And he had a very challenging mission, which he did very well. And unfortunately, I think some of the excess, the danger that he faced, and it was certainly not helped by the fact that there were not that the situation did not allow bureaucratically for more resources. And
so and so Ethan, how does that tie to the actual attack? Can you take us back? For many of this, it was in the past. We haven't really, seen much recently in the news about it. How did security get breached in the embassy? We actually had a question come in around like how maybe this has even changed security in U.S. embassies around the world since. But how most embassies I've seen look like a fortress. So how did the attackers manage to get in and murder 4 American citizens?
Well, it wasn't very hard. I think that's the basic answer. Essentially, Chris and and his colleagues and American foreign policy got stuck between a high-level directive to intervene and change the regime, even if that wasn't the initial intention, and the imperative that if you intervene at that level and at that depth and you create a power vacuum, those responsible have an obligation to come and help set things straight. And the United States did not want to do that. And the resources that were assigned to, say, this outpost, this outpost was almost like something you reach for and try and use it as a marker to try to as a place where you're going to build something else, right? So the fact that there was, again, this tension between the high-level decision makers around the president who wanted a light intervention, and those like Stevens and also Secretary Clinton, who were agitating for in some ways ironically a more fortified presence in the East. That's where it's sort of like it's almost like a misalignment of messaging on a whole number of levels.
So, and once this sort of attack happened, which was horrific, there was this resulting scandal that became much more than just the murder of an ambassador and 3 colleagues. Can you talk a little bit about what is this scandal, just to remind us, like how this devolved into something much broader?
So just a few hours before the attack in Benghazi, there was a demonstration and then a violent protest, if not attack, attack on the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, in Egypt. And within the hours, that event and the Benghazi attack became, in the minds of many policymakers back in Washington and the media, and the Romney campaign got involved in this early on, who was opposing as President Obama at the time. There was this sort of confounding of events, the idea that somehow the causes of the attack in the embassy in Cairo were the same as those that were in the attack in Benghazi, simply because they were proximate in time. And also there was a video made. It was an anti-Islamic hate video that was made in America by a former Egyptian national who, that video became associated with a whole range of attacks against U.S. missions in the days around Benghazi. So the question became pretty quickly, what happened in Benghazi? And was it connected to this video, or was it an independent planned, was sort of an atmospheric random attack that, people were angry at the video and just decided to go and trash and attack these posts? Or was it a pre-planned attack using the video as kind of a bit of cover? And so that became, the Obama administration basically chose not to make explicit. I mean, this is where things get complicated quickly, because on one hand, we really didn't have a whole lot of resources on the ground in Libya. There were pieces of the intelligence agencies that understood that Al-Qaeda was using proxies as a means of not Al-Qaeda labeled organizations, but closely aligned organizations linked to some of those groups that had been rendered earlier that I spoke about as a kind of a spearhead to deeper destabilize Libya. So again, there was this misunderstanding, I think a mixture of misunderstanding and also a very deep kind of aversion, which played into the pre-existing partisan dynamics. The Obama administration absolutely did not want to have anything to do with Al-Qaeda or 9/11 come up just before the elections, which of course was the original Republican complaint against the Democrats, that in fact, instead of just calling it a terrorist attack like it was, they sort of tried to kick the can down the street. And I think that the Obama administration actually, this is where I wouldn't make no friends in some of my arguments in the book, because I think that the Republicans had a point on that one issue. At the same time, of course, the Democratic aversion to calling things like it was and dealing with the issue was caused in large part by relentless Republican attacks before that. And there were several instances that I relate in the book which show that there's this progression of 9/11 related event, and administration tries to pull back, surrounds themselves more with more communications types that then sort of blast this message that things are okay, and it just feeds. And this is part of the reason that Benghazi became such a fireworks, in the sense that there were many things going on at the same time. You had an election coming up very quickly in a few weeks. You had the whole 9/11 issue was very prominent. I mean, that was, the Romney campaign built its part of its pillar was that the Obama administration was not taking care of securing the United States. And then you had other things that were less obvious, like the evolution of social media, which I spoke with a number of experts in social media evolution, that were saying that, in fact, in that period of fall of 2012, the sort of power of the internet to push people into silos through algorithms and cause this sort of ricocheting extremism was much greater than it had been at any point in time before that. So there was this sort of confluence of factors. And of course, 9/11 was also a proxy for other political arguments that the United States and that Democrats and Republicans could use against one another. So Benghazi, the city, which basically nobody knew much about at all, became like this screen on which both right and left could project the worst images of each other and start to, essentially, as I call it, exercise in self-harm. If Al-Qaeda wanted to do America damage, they've certainly learned their lesson by that point, that the best way to do that is to stoke American domestic fights. And that's one of my bigger points, is that, if you look back to the 9/11, original 9/11 up through the other 9/11, then Benghazi, you had this, Al-Qaeda has managed to, even though now both the leaders of Al-Qaeda have been killed, the damage that they've done has been to American society is incalculable.
Well, and you mentioned in the book too, and I'd love to talk about this for a moment. Not only did Benghazi have an immediate impact on the 2016 elections and kind of domestic issues, but it also really had an impact on not just our foreign relations with countries like Syria, Iran, and Russia, but the way that they move forward after watching how the U.S. reacted to Benghazi. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because that does seem to be one of the lasting impacts, especially as we're dealing with situations with, all three of these countries today.
Sure. Well, one quick point on the election is that I don't think that most Americans associate with Benghazi with the outcome of the 2016 election.
Absolutely not. No, it's pretty interesting that you bring that up.
And I found it quite interesting that in interviews with senior Obama administration officials and others, there's certainly a consciousness on the part of many of them that in fact Benghazi was a major factor in the election for all of it's precisely for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, that it was a trigger for and a very powerful, potent tool. Hillary Clinton said herself in one of her memoirs that I think what happened, that it was like a slime that she could never quite wipe off. And that is, even though it morphed into the thing about Hillary Clinton's emails and other things, all of those things and Comey's statements and other things which I describe in the book, that was the common denominator was Benghazi. And the Russian cyber attacks, which used the Benghazi memes and things as one of their primary feedstocks. But to your point about American foreign relations and the appetites of other of our adversaries, the fact that, for example, Trump was our next president put into play lots of other things, like he immediately abrogated the Iran nuclear deal and other conventions, which then completely changed the relationship with respect to Iran. At the same time, Benghazi, the fright, the risk aversion increasing side of that event forced us to essentially provoked Americans for recalling their diplomats and their spies from places like Yemen, where Iran was backing the Houthi rebels. We didn't quite understand the threat that was brewing there, partially because we had collapsed or sort of retreated within ourselves. And there are in various situations like this, you had other adversaries of the United States, whether it's China, Russia, or Iran, basically saying, "Look, this is a great opportunity. The United States is sort of retreating, and we're going to increase our influence in its stead." And there's a good one of the Arabic dailies had a cartoon that showed a flying dragon basically flying over an American eagle with a direction saying Middle East. I mean, that's the sort of the situation we're in. Lots of people say, well, why are we in the Middle East? It's just a never-ending cycle of bad things that bounce back on us. But the fact is, if you leave it alone, there are other people. It's a contest in which or a board on which many other contests are being played, and you can't simply abandon it and expect you're going to be better off.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great theme you have throughout the book, which is like, if America chooses, intentionally or not, to not be involved or to exercise influence, others will step into that vacuum, and they may not be the ones that you were hoping for. Well, just to wrap up before we go into questions, I think kind of the key thing here is, like, 10 years out, why does Benghazi matter? We have democracy on the wane, autocracies on the rise, war in Ukraine, revolution in Iran happening. What's sort of the relevancy now, and why should we care about Benghazi a decade later?
Well, I think it's like a portal into or a case study of American political and bureaucratic dysfunction. And learning those lessons will enable us to face some of the challenges that we have today. I mean, to the point of the question of, is democracy on the wane, et cetera, one thing that Benghazi demonstrated through all of the effects that I just mentioned was that the professional bureaucracies, particularly in the Foreign Service, the CIA, the NSA, all these organizations are there, and they have experts who have trained for years to try to understand their fields of study, and politics has come in and basically kind of upended all of those relationships to the point where, and I think each administration since the Bush administration has sort of made it worse, but in different ways, and while at the same time trying to cope with that. So one argument that I make is that that absolutely we need to figure out how to depoliticize our professional bureaucracies and attract and incentivize the best people to go and work there. Otherwise, you've got these great gaps and discontinuities in knowledge about places like Libya. So, if and when you do intervene, you can actually have a source of expert advice. I mean, Chris Stevens, as ironic and crazy as this sounds, was sort of like the one person left in the Foreign Service who had spent much time in Benghazi. How could that be? You know, it's and the burden falls on him. Of course, you know, we know what happened after that.
Yeah, you make a great point at the end of the book. I'm very aligned on this philosophy that like the best way that we can kind of create a better, more stable world is through exchange, getting people to travel, seeing other things, encouraging that curiosity. And that can lead to careers in it, like you were saying, to really depoliticize things like foreign service. Chris was in the Peace Corps, you know, those kind of opportunities really open up a world and start to see things in a less, you know, biased or polarized way. Ethan, we have some questions coming in, and I'm just wondering if it's okay if we kind of start to pick up on these.
Sure.
All right. So one is about like kind of this current generation in Libya. So if with the younger folks that may have been, you know, quite young when the Benghazi attack happened, how did they see that? Have you had a chance to talk with people or go back since and kind of just get a sense for self-perception and nationalism, you know, since all of this has occurred over the last 10 years?
That's a great question. And, you know, Libyans have been sort of victimized over you know, multiple times. You know, certainly under Gaddafi, the opportunities for advancement and if you weren't aligned with the ruling regime in a very close, were very few. And people talked about the lost generation, but the generation that came after the intervention was even more traumatized. And you have a whole, you know, it's been 10 years, so people who were very young at the time have now been exposed the majority of their lives to an endless conflict that really in many ways didn't need to happen. And with respect to how they view the Benghazi attack, I think the overall impression of younger people in Libya is much less positive towards the United States than it had been at the beginning. So that's one difference. It's also forced people to be very resourceful, but it's been a very damaging. The last 10 years have been absolutely heartbreaking and heart-wrenching for the Libyan people and the young people in particular. You know, and many have turned to you know, participating with militias, and you know, lots of scores and scores of lives have been basically lost as a result. Not surprisingly.
Have you been back since? And if so, what's it like?
Well, I went back in 2000. You know, I was sort of I felt for several years writing commentary on Libya that I really needed to go back. So I made another one of my sort of in retrospect kind of crazy decisions, which was to go back to Benghazi in 2006 at the end of 2016 and try to see what was, you know, try to interview as many people as possible. And I felt disconnect, you know, like I couldn't in good conscience keep talking about Libya without being back. And that was a rather hairy trip as well, which I described in the book, and one of the more vivid memories of recently of mine. But so, sorry, what was the?
Oh, it was kind of, yeah. What was the atmosphere like when you were there? Just in terms of taking us to, you know, is it a functioning state? Is it total chaos? What's the general mood
Of the population? That's all reasons the media doesn't want to talk about Libya these days.
Right, again, you don't see it at all.
Very complicated. You know, you don't. It's interesting, you know, a very visible former New York Times correspondent or New York Times correspondent was writing a book about the Arab Spring, and his editors apparently told him to leave out Libya because it's too complicated. And that sort of sums up the whole attitude. It's actually not that complicated. We essentially created, I talked about the militaristic and the Islamist client states of the United States before. We essentially created the embryos of the two groups that are now fighting over the future of Libya, backed by other countries in the region who have an interest in keeping Libya unstable.
And who are those countries, just to get a sense of sort of the geopolitics at play?
Well,
here?
Everybody who's in Libyan studies is divided fiercely, or Middle Eastern studies is divided fiercely in their loyalties over or perceived loyalties over this question. You know, there are a number of countries that like Turkey and Qatar who were sort of on one side of the Islamist divide and support the Muslim Brotherhood and many of their connected organizations, and I explain all of that in the book, and as And then on the other side, you've got other countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia and to various, that have a very different perspective on this and feel that perceive that those developments as a direct threat. And challenge the United States to try to come in and help sort these things out. And meanwhile, again, to the point before about creating opportunities for other countries to come in, all of these countries now see Libya, this large, wealthy country that's in chaos, as a platform for expanding their own influence in the Mediterranean and beyond. So it's and the hostages are the Libyan people.
Well, and we have a question about that. And so you did an incredible number of interviews for this book with some very interesting people, including some survivors of the attack. And I know you can't include everything in the book, but were there any particular stories that you heard from survivors that really kind of stuck or even haunted you in terms of what they'd been through?
Survivors of the attack itself?
Yeah.
We were sort of saying there were the sort of official Americans who were in the compound and in the CIA annex that was attacked afterward. And I did talk with several of those, but their accounts are quite are out there. Actually, most of the people that I spoke with, since that had been done so well, many of my interviews were with unofficial witnesses, people who weren't called before the Benghazi committee in the end, or any of the other congressional committees, who had seen some part of the event and were like, again, disputed the official version of events. Mm-hmm. And one of the striking things was, in that sense, was that you had these witnesses, including, myself, who all talked to each other and sort of knew each other's stories, but they never officially sort of queried about what they saw. And had those queries come very quickly and been passed up the line or had been paid attention to, whatever you. I think the outcome of the Benghazi scandal would not have been allowed to grow so great. And that is coupled with an independent bureaucracy that's able to speak its mind without influence of politics.
And speaking of politics, were there things that you intentionally left out of the book or were pressured not to include?
Is that a question?
Yes, it's a question. It's a question.
From the listeners.
Well, it was, I'm modifying. It was, what did you want to include in the book, but was left out? And I'm adding potentially there may be some incentives to not.
That's a great question. I mean, the really part of the problem with writing this book and publishing it was that there are various filters without any accusations. I think the media itself is very allergic to this topic, and in part because it's complicit. I think the media really, on one hand, both sides, left and right, center, if there is one remaining, all stoked this conflict for their own, whatever you want to call it,
readership
certainly, and political reasons. The book got rejected more times than I can count over the years, and that's one of the reasons that it took a while to get it out. But it's interesting, the feedback that I was getting was, it's one, too controversial, and second, it's too nobody wants to hear anything about Benghazi. No one will buy a book about Benghazi, and enough time anyway. So I've had to make I did not want to come out with arms swinging and make, I wanted to be able to basically give my version of events as I experienced it and try to weigh as many of the other factors and give my interpretation of what happened. What happened in Benghazi? Where did it come from? And what were the impacts on the U.S. and its politics and foreign policy? So I had to make some compromises, and I didn't want to be, intentionally did not want to be gratuitously provocative but I didn't hold back in terms of my own, I'm on the left. I'm from Berkeley. It's not surprising. I'm on the left side of the aisle. But I also found there to be serious criticisms of the way that the Democrats messaged things and how they cope with political adversity, which I hope again would be an inspiration. That's the kind of message that I think we need to hear more of. And the right, again, it's sort of part of the whole vicious circle is this blanket accusation of each side. Now, of course, most Democrats will probably say, "Oh, the Republicans are unredeemable," But in fact, it's not so simple. So
No, well,
that's a long way of saying I think I did not. I had to be very careful in terms of how I told this story, but I didn't want to leave out any relevant details or really where my heart lay with respect to the material. So that's.
And it's a very readable book. I really enjoyed it because you have your sort of personal stories throughout, but you also kind of tie in these various events and trends that really map out kind of from a systemic perspective, like how this happened and then the impact after. And I just want to go back to, I think you give a nice, like, kind of equal view, if not criticism, of both the Republicans and the Democrats. And you had a chance to interview Ben Rhodes for this, who, I enjoy his podcast, but he's also, he was kind of storyteller in chief in terms of painting the right message or intentionally leaving certain things out. And I was just wondering, could you talk a little bit about that? Because that is so, it's something that we're not always cognizant of as government employees or being part of this messaging, but it definitely sends a lot of signals at a diplomatic level, even just small things that the president might say or kind of quip.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's absolutely right. That part of the dynamic that I described is that both that the communications smiths, the people who are trying to tell the stories, play a huge role in not only the domestic political context, but by extension, American foreign policy. So you have somebody like Ben Rhodes, who I actually enjoyed talking to, a very smart guy, and he was put into a position which he, which played to his strengths. But the one has to question whether the as a whole, the group around the president and the political advisors are chosen more for their communication skills than their policy interpretation or projection skills. And that's where, if you can have that system, but if you have to have a means to tap into the experts who are telling you, this is a really bad idea, or if you're going to do this, you need to consider X, Y, and Z factors. And yes, absolutely. The Democrats are not immune to shaping the story. And I actually feel that and I say it very clearly, that the Democrats made a tactical error with Benghazi, and one that had a lot of consequences. If they had said, look, this is what happened, at a certain point, they owned the story. They couldn't go back and redo it. But they've just said at various points in time, look, or reached out and wanted to know the answer and converted that into an exercise in building support, we probably would not have had this. The scandal might have been averted.
Okay. Last question here, because I know we just have a few minutes to wrap up. Do you think a U.S. embassy attack could take place in China or Russia? I guess based on what you know in terms of how this evolved in Benghazi, is something similar possible in these superpowers?
Well, it would certainly take anything's possible, but there are formal. It would be a completely different scenario from a tactical perspective. One, it would have to be, you don't have this sort of very vulnerable facility that's not protected. We have an established relationship and a huge embassy in these places, and it would have to be, unless the state is collapsing upon itself, it would have to be done with under the auspices of the regime itself. So, but I guess the bigger point is that diplomats actually do undertake a great deal of risk. When I was taking the Foreign Service exam, and then in the exercises they make you do when you join, a lot of it is sort of trying to put yourself in the mindset of what happens when the mission you're in is attacked, and how do you not freak out? So
absolutely, yeah. So I guess in our just final comments here, Ethan, what are your thoughts in terms of moving forward? You mentioned earlier about lessons learned. Like, this is a great case study, Benghazi, in terms of what not to do. So yeah, if we can teach this to our policy students, to our diplomats, it helps in terms of turning failure into lessons learned. Anything else that you think, if people just understood better what happened here, how could we apply that to making the future a bit more secure or a better place?
Well, I think the role of Benghazi in American political polarization and the mechanism whereby that happened is really important to understand, because it essentially has brought us, whether something else might have happened that could have brought us in the same path. I personally think that Benghazi accelerated that process greatly. And if we can understand that, we have a better perspective with which to analyze where we are now. I mean, it's almost like a dirty secret that we can't talk about because we've been conditioned to run away from it. So I think that's, that is, if we can relook at, reframe, re-examine Benghazi and take those lessons from it, it's not just a tragedy that happened to 4 people, but it actually changed the way that America relates to itself and relates to the world. Then we can be better able to make sure that doesn't happen so easily in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ethan.
Thank you.
Read the book. I loved it. Big fan, and really a pleasure to be able to chat with you about it here tonight.
And thank you, Book Passage, and all of your great crew there. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ethan Chorin, Whitney Hischier. This has been a wonderful hour. We've learned so much. The book is available at Book Passage. We have lots of copies. It would make a wonderful holiday gift. We gift wrap. We ship all over the country. And again, we are able to bring you these free complimentary events because you buy your books at Book Passage. So for all of you out there, thank you for supporting independent bookstores. It is such a vital component to everyone's community. Book Passage, again, has been around for 40 years, and we hope to continue to stay and be a huge community for the Bay Area. So buy your books at Book Passage. Again, the title is Benghazi by Ethan Chorin. We have lots of copies. Come in and get yours. And thank you so much to our 2 amazing guests tonight. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you at Book Passage. Good night.
Thank you.